when a young boy and his parents were caught in a horrific car crash that left both parents in a coma. The boy's life was cast into disarray. However, the story takes a sinister turn as the pieces unravel, revealing a dark conspiracy, one that put his life in unimaginable danger. This is a story of bravery, resilience, and the relentless fight for justice. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe the truth should always come to light, be sure to like and subscribe for more. Sam Greenfield was only 12 years old, and though he did not realize it then, his entire world was about to transform in ways he could scarcely imagine. It all began on that sunny Saturday afternoon, when he sat in the back seat of his parents' car, humming along to cheerful Beatles music. There was a warmth in the air, the sun casting bright beams across the freeway. Sam's father, Mark Greenfield, was an attentive driver most of the time, but in that moment, he had let himself relax. Alice Greenfield, Sam's mother, had turned in her seat to joke with her son about his off-key singing. Sam grinned in embarrassment, but he loved the feeling of togetherness in the car that day. It was such a simple pleasure, riding with his parents, music on the radio, no worries in the world. From the outside, the Greenfield family's life might have appeared blissful. Mark was a respected detective in the local police force, a man who was known for his methodical thinking and calm demeanor. Alice had a gentle heart, always volunteering at local community events and making sure everyone around her felt seen and cared for. Sam, for his part, was academically gifted. He was quiet, more apt to read a book during recess than to run around with the other kids, but he was curious and thoughtful. It was a close-knit family, each day beginning with a shared breakfast and ending with a conversation around the dinner table about how their day had gone. That sense of safety shattered so swiftly, Sam could scarcely process it. One moment, he felt Alice's eyes on him as she teased him for forgetting a lyric in the Beatles song. The next, Mark let out a startled yell. Sam's heart lunged into his throat. Outside his window, there was a streak of rust-colored metal. A beat-up old car had come out of nowhere, swerving dangerously across lanes with no license plate visible. It moved as if it wanted to sideswipe them. Mark slammed the steering wheel to the right in an attempt to avoid a collision. Sam's stomach dropped in terror. The tires screeched, and time seemed to slow. The swirl of screeching metal and the cacophony of the radio turned into a sickening roar as Mark lost control. The Greenfield's car spun twice, maybe 3 times, then lurched off the road. Sam heard his mother scream. His own heartbeat pounded in his ears. The car flipped. Then it flipped again. His seatbelt dug painfully into his shoulder. He caught a glimpse of the old, rusted vehicle disappearing into the distance without stopping. Finally, their car slammed upside down. The windshield shattered. The hiss of twisted metal settled into a haunting silence. For a moment, Sam blacked out, or perhaps he was in a state of shock that made everything fuzzy around the edges. His lungs burned, and when he opened his eyes he was still strapped in, upside down. Shards of glass sparkled around him like malevolent stars. The first thought that blossomed in his head was, "Mom? Dad?" Panic gripped him. He craned his neck and saw both of them in the front seat, unconscious. Blood trickled from a cut on Mark's forehead, and Alice was still, as if she had forgotten how to breathe. Sam's limbs trembled. He attempted to undo his seatbelt. The latch stuck for a heartbeat, then gave way. He fell onto what had been the roof of the car with a thud. His entire body felt battered. He could not afford to waste time. He found his phone, unbelievably still functioning despite a cracked screen, and called the police. His voice shook as he said, "I need help, my parents are hurt. We had a crash on the freeway. Please hurry." The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional, guiding him to check if his parents were breathing, to stay on the line. He managed to do as told, though his hands shook uncontrollably. Within minutes, sirens howled in the distance, quickly growing louder. An ambulance, a fire truck, and police vehicles raced to the scene. Sam sat just off to the side of the wreck, tears streaming down his cheeks, unable to tear his eyes away from the unconscious forms of Mark and Alice. Firefighters swarmed in, using specialized equipment to cut through the car's mangled metal. Sam watched in stunned silence as they carefully extracted his mother first, then his father. Paramedics stabilized them, rushed them into ambulances. That was the last time Sam saw them awake, breathing on their own, for what felt like a lifetime. Both Mark and Alice sank into comas, severe head injuries casting dark shadows over their fates. In the days that followed, Sam felt as though he were moving through a dream, no, a nightmare. The hospital became a second home, with its pale walls, antiseptic smells, and the constant background hum of beeping machines. One day blurred into the next. Sam's uncle, Andy Greenfield, arrived to take him in temporarily, since Sam had no siblings, and Andy was his only nearby relative. Andy was younger than Mark by almost 10 years, a jovial man with a gentle spirit who wore his heart on his sleeve. He had come as soon as he heard the news, and his sorrow at seeing his brother comatose was nearly as deep as Sam's fear for his parents' lives. Every day, Andy and Sam visited Mark and Alice in the hospital. They would sit by the hospital beds, each side by side in a small ward lined with beeping monitors. Sam talked softly to them, never certain if his words made any difference, but he recalled overhearing that sometimes coma patients could hear voices and find comfort in them. He described his day to them, told them about the flurry of well-wishes from neighbors and acquaintances, about how he was still going to school, though he had difficulty concentrating on anything. He told them how lonely and terrifying it was not to have them around. Sometimes, Andy placed a reassuring hand on Sam's shoulder, reminding him to take a breath. But even in those earliest days after the crash, Sam's mind was nagged by a single thought: the old, rusted car with no license plate. It had swerved at them on purpose. That was what he believed with every fiber of his being. He was certain the crash was no accident. He had told the police as much, but there was precious little to go on. The officers said they would be on the lookout, but with no plate, no description of the driver except a man maybe middle-aged, and only Sam's recollection of the rust color. They had no immediate leads. Sam shared his suspicion with Andy one morning as they sipped cheap coffee from the hospital cafeteria and stared out the window at the overcast sky. Sam's face was pale with exhaustion, but his eyes were burning with urgency. "I think the car wanted to hit us," he said in a trembling voice. "They drove right at us. I saw the way they jerked the wheel. It wasn't a mistake." Andy listened gravely. "I believe you, Sam," he replied. "And you know your dad, if there was any reason someone would want him out of the way." His voice trailed off, and he did not need to finish the thought. Mark Greenfield, dedicated detective, might well have been digging into a case too dangerous or stepping on the wrong toes. Andy's mouth set in a determined line. "We won't let this rest." Sam was both relieved and deeply afraid. I want to do something. I can't stand just waiting." He swallowed hard, remembering the sight of that battered old car speeding away as he dangled upside down in his own seatbelt. Andy placed his hand gently on Sam's shoulder. "We will," he said. "We'll do it carefully and figure out what your father was working on. I know Mark. He kept a tidy workspace, but he also had a hidden lockbox in his office where he kept sensitive documents." Andy offered Sam the faintest flicker of a comforting smile. "We'll start there." And so the seeds of a clandestine investigation were planted. Sam went about his school routine as best he could, but every spare moment was consumed with worry over his parents' condition and the burning need to find out who had caused the accident. He spent as much time as possible with Andy, rummaging through Mark's home office. It was an austere room with neatly filed paperwork and labeled binders, and the desk was an immaculate setup of a computer, a lamp, and a writing pad. Yet in the back of one drawer, they found a locked metal box. Andy jimmied it open with a small tool set. Inside the box was a collection of files that made Sam's breath catch in his throat. Pages upon pages of notes, photos, names, addresses, evidence detailing a child trafficking operation. The pictures showed grim images of terrified children, a few of them battered and bruised. The text described everything from transport routes to rumored safe houses. Mark had jotted down line after line in that neat handwriting Sam knew so well. A sickening dread spread through Sam as he realized how deep his father must have gone in investigating this. If Mark had discovered something so heinous, so large, it was no wonder powerful criminals might have wanted to silence him. "Uncle Andy," Sam said shakily, "do you think, could this have anything to do with the crash?" Andy exhaled slowly, scanning the horrifying details. "I'd bet money on it," he answered. He closed the file and sighed. "Your dad was a good detective, one of the best. If he was onto a ring like this, they might have decided to make sure he couldn't reveal any evidence." Sam felt a swirl of fear and anger. "We have to find out who was in that car," he insisted, raising his voice. His small hands gripped the edges of the file so tightly that the paper crinkled. "I'm not just going to let them get away with this." Andy nodded, equally resolute. "We won't," he said. "But we need to be careful. These are dangerous people, Sam. They tried to run your parents off the road, and they nearly succeeded in killing them. We can't just go at this without planning." Sam understood. He was terrified, yes, but that terror was tempered by a raging sense of injustice. He would not let his parents remain in peril, not while the people who harmed them roamed free. With new determination in their hearts, they began a series of clandestine trips. They visited Mark's acquaintances on the force, gleaning small pieces of information where they could, but they had to remain discreet. If someone on the inside was complicit, tipping them off would be catastrophic. They studied the files in Mark's box, creating a list of names and addresses, individuals who, according to Mark's notes, might be connected to the operation in one capacity or another. The plan was simple but dangerous. They would track down each name, observe them from a distance, look for any sign of the old rusted car. Sam insisted on coming along every time. Andy, at first reluctant, eventually saw that Sam was not going to back down. And in a twisted way, they both needed to do this for their family. They needed to keep going. They needed to help the police, to make sure the evidence Mark was gathering did not fall into the wrong hands or vanish altogether. The hospital remained a place of heartbreak and determination. Sam and Andy would visit Mark and Alice, speak to the doctors. The doctors were grim in their assessment. Both had sustained significant head trauma. There was no telling when, or if, they would regain consciousness. The reality was crushing. Sam would try to stay brave, but he often found himself blinking back tears whenever he stepped into that ward, hearing the steady beeps of the machines that kept his parents alive. He would hold Alice's hand, feeling how cold her skin was, and whisper, "Dad was working on a case. We found the files. Uncle Andy and I are going to figure it out. Everything's going to be okay. Please, please come back and talk to me." Then he would look over at Mark, who lay motionless in the bed next to hers. Sam desperately wanted his father's guidance on what to do next, wanted to hear that soft yet firm voice instructing him on the right course of action. But all he had was silence. Despite the heartbreak, each visit fueled Sam's determination. He wanted to be strong for his parents, to make them proud. That was how it started, this long, perilous journey into the dark underbelly that Mark had been investigating. Sam and Andy found themselves driving all over the city, crossing neighborhoods both wealthy and impoverished, following the clues scribbled in Mark's notes. They posed as ordinary passers-by, or sometimes as potential renters or contractors, just to have an excuse to see a property. They took pictures of the vehicles in front of homes or businesses linked to the suspects. They watched from afar, hiding behind tinted windows. Sam's heart raced each time they approached a new location. Andy tried to keep him safe by parking a good distance away, but Sam insisted on seeing for himself. "I'll know the car if I see it," he told Andy repeatedly. Their initial leads yielded no immediate sign of the rusty old car, but they did start to piece together more details about the operation. Many of the names in Mark's file were mid-level criminals or unscrupulous associates, who might know something but were unlikely to hold the highest rank in that twisted underworld. They learned that children were often smuggled across state lines. The traffickers used seemingly innocuous businesses as fronts, an auto repair shop here, a private daycare center there. The deeper Sam and Andy dug, the more repulsed and incensed they became. The ring had spread its tentacles throughout the area, and it was not clear who could be trusted. More than once, they parked outside an address, only to see an unmarked van slip away into the night. Over weeks, the sense of danger escalated. Sam began receiving strange calls on the home phone number. No one spoke on the other end. He would answer with a trembling hand, hearing only the faint hiss of static before the call disconnected. Andy, concerned, suggested they might be drawing unwanted attention to themselves. Yet their resolve never wavered. Whenever Sam felt his fear rise to the surface, he remembered the sight of his parents lying lifeless in that hospital ward, and that memory stoked his anger. He refused to back down. There were moments of odd tension with the local police as well. Sam tried to provide them with the details from his father's files, but some officers seemed dismissive or claimed there was nothing they could do without Mark's testimony. One day, after an especially frustrating interaction where a sergeant said, "We can't just take the word of a child, and we have no official corroboration," Sam stormed away, his fists clenched. Andy followed, muttering that they were obviously dealing with some corruption in the force, or at least a reluctance to handle such a big case. Mark had apparently been gathering evidence alone for a reason. Still, they pressed on, continuing to cross names off Mark's list. They were searching for the driver of that old, no-license plate car. They pinned up photos on a corkboard at home, drawing lines between persons of interest, addresses, and suspicious patterns. Andy handled the lion's share of the analysis, but Sam's sharp young mind proved invaluable. He noticed details in Mark's scribbled notes that Andy missed. He remembered small clues from each location, like a broken tail light or a distinctive sticker on a property fence. The more Sam learned, the more he was sure that the ring was orchestrated by a handful of dangerous individuals, each pulling strings behind the scenes. The nightmares began soon after Sam started seeing the grisly evidence of child trafficking. He often woke up in a cold sweat, reliving the crash in slow motion, or worse, imagining the children in those photographs calling out for help, their voices merging with Alice's and Mark's screams. Some nights, Sam crept out of bed and wandered the hallway until he found himself in Mark's study, gazing at the documents under the warm glow of a desk lamp. It was as though he could feel his father's presence there, urging him onward. One particular file, dated just 2 weeks before the accident, contained a name circled in red ink, Rafael Diaz. Next to it, Mark had written, "Sources say heavily involved, likely runs local distribution. Approach with caution." Sam stared at that name for a long time. A local address was listed. If Mark believed that this man was a key figure, then it made sense that he might have been involved in the attempt to silence Mark. Sam pointed out the file to Andy. "Look at this. Dad wrote that Diaz might run local distribution. That means he must be an important link in the chain," Sam said, tapping his finger on the typed text. "We have to see if he's connected to the crash." Andy nodded. "We'll investigate, but we'll do it carefully." He pulled out a map of the city, which had multiple red and blue pins scattered about. Andy placed a fresh pin in the approximate area where Diaz supposedly lived. "We'll watch first. If we see the car there, we call the police. If we see anything suspicious, we report it." They planned for the weekend, choosing a time when Sam was free from school obligations. That Saturday morning, they woke early. Sam's heart fluttered with nervous energy. The hospital visit came first, though. They spent an hour with Mark and Alice, as always, softly talking, letting them know that they were not alone. Sam whispered that he was close to finding the culprit. He found himself trembling as he pressed a hand to his mother's, wishing she would squeeze back. But her fingers lay limp. Then they climbed into Andy's car. It was an older model sedan, black and unremarkable, perfect for blending in. They drove across the city, passing rows of boarded-up shops and weather-beaten apartment buildings. Eventually, they found themselves in a neighborhood known for petty crime. The houses were cramped together, paint peeling from eaves, and chain-link fences surrounded small yards. They parked half a block away from the address in Mark's file. From the vantage point behind tinted windows, they could see the address clearly, an old, sagging 2-story building with graffiti scrawled across the side. The front yard was cluttered with trash. A battered couch sat on the front porch, and an older man wearing a stained tank top glanced around suspiciously as he smoked a cigarette. This was the environment Sam had only ever glimpsed in pictures. Now he was witnessing it in real life. The air was tense. Sam's gaze scanned each vehicle parked along the street. None resembled that rusted old horror that had run them off the road. So they waited. Hours passed with no sign of Diaz or the car. Andy tried to break the monotony with hushed conversation, but Sam's mind was far away. He felt the dryness in his mouth and the relentless pounding of his heart. The sense of danger was palpable. Nothing came of that first stakeout. They returned home late, deflated. But they did not give up. They went back the next day, then the next, carefully shifting the times they arrived. It was a tedious and disheartening process. Eventually, though, Sam and Andy caught sight of a man stepping out of that sagging two-story house. He was of medium height, stocky build, wearing a dark jacket despite the warm weather. Sam's eyes narrowed. Could this be Rafael Diaz? They snapped a few pictures from their phone. But still, the man did not walk to a rusted car. He climbed into a small SUV and drove off, leaving Sam and Andy without any firm connection to the crash. Days turned into weeks. Sam continued attending school, though his classmates treated him delicately, aware of the tragedy that had befallen his family. He endured awkward questions and well-meaning expressions of sympathy. Teachers gave him extra time on assignments he did not want to do. In the back of his mind, he was always thinking about the ring, about his parents in their silent hospital ward, about the lengths criminals would go to in order to hide their tracks. He was certain the answer was somewhere on Mark's list. They had gone through nearly half of the names when they finally encountered their first dangerous moment. It was a late evening, the sky soaked in the orange glow of a setting sun. Andy had driven them across town to check on a suspected stash house, a dilapidated warehouse near the industrial district, where Mark's notes indicated children might have been temporarily held. From the outside, it looked deserted. The windows were grimy, some broken, and a chain rattled over the front entrance. Sam took pictures while Andy idled in a discreet location across the street. Suddenly, the warehouse door opened. A tall figure emerged. He glared at their vehicle, as if sensing something off. Sam and Andy ducked. They could not see the man's face in detail, but they heard him shout. "What do you want?" The figure growled in a voice that echoed across the empty lot. He took a few steps towards the street, scanning for any signs of watchers. Andy clenched the steering wheel, ready to drive off if the man drew any closer. Sam's heart pounded. "Go," he whispered, eyes darting around for the potential of a rusted old car lurking. But there was no other vehicle in sight. Andy pressed gently on the accelerator, and their car drifted away from the warehouse. Their breath came in ragged bursts. Sam craned his neck to look back, but the man had disappeared behind the locked door. They made a note of the incident, a fresh wave of anxiety propelling them forward. Whoever was behind that door clearly did not want visitors. Through it all, Sam kept returning to the hospital, kept seeing his parents lying in that same, unchanged state. It hurt more than anything to walk in each day, see them connected to tubes and monitors. A well-meaning nurse patted Sam's head once and said, "You're such a brave young man. They would be proud of you." Sam forced a smile, but inside, he felt tears threatening to break free. He did not feel brave. He felt like a helpless child, stumbling around in the dark, searching for answers to a puzzle that was too big for him to solve. It was on one of those bleak mornings that Sam and Andy discovered a new lead, a partial plate number from Mark's personal notes, that corresponded to a suspicious vehicle seen at multiple addresses. The plate itself did not match the old, rusted car, obviously lacking any digits. However, the partial plate was linked to a certain Marco Cruz, a known associate of Rafael Diaz. Mark had scribbled, "Suspect intimidation tactics, known enforcer," next to Cruz's name. This could be the man who actually drove the death trap. Or maybe he was connected to the driver. Sam and Andy decided to stake out Cruz's known hangouts as well, hoping to catch a glimpse of something that matched the battered metal image burned into Sam's memory. They spent days driving from one place to another, crossing off addresses, scanning for a particular hulk of rust. Each time they arrived somewhere, Sam's pulse thundered. He felt a mixture of dread and excitement, as though each second might bring them face to face with the criminal who nearly destroyed his family. Twice, they had brushes with menacing individuals who glared at them suspiciously. Andy was forced to move on quickly, not wanting to provoke a confrontation. Tension grew like a thick haze around them. The quest became exhausting. Sam lost weight, his appetite poor. Andy juggled his day job with these nightly stakeouts and research sessions, growing haggard in appearance. The hospital staff began asking if Sam was getting enough rest. He tried to appear normal, tried to hold back the storms that raged inside him. Then, after nearly a month of searching, they finally found themselves near the end of Mark's list. Name after name had been observed and checked. The men they saw often matched the descriptions in Mark's notes: petty criminals, shady figures with possible connections to the ring. But there had been no sign of that unmistakable rusty, unmarked car. It was late on a Friday afternoon when Andy and Sam pulled up outside a narrow, rundown residential street. It was the 27th name on Mark's list, Rafael Diaz himself. Sam remembered the circled name in red ink. He felt goosebumps. The address was at the far edge of the city, near a stretch of cheap motels and abandoned lots. The street was quiet, with only a few battered cars parked here and there, weeds sprouting through the cracked sidewalks. As Andy eased their vehicle to a stop, Sam's eyes searched frantically. Then his breath caught in his throat. Parked halfway down the block, partially hidden by the shadow of a towering chain-link fence, was a rusted old car. The same color, the same model, its bumper pockmarked with decay, its body dented in multiple places. No license plate. Sam's blood ran cold. His hand gripped Andy's arm. "That's it," he breathed, voice shaking. "That's the car." For a few seconds neither of them spoke. Andy stared, heart pounding. "Are you sure?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Sam had described that vehicle so often, he could have picked it out among 1,000 others. "Yes," Sam said, his voice hoarse. "I'll never forget it." They parked discreetly, a short distance away. Sam's eyes flicked over the other houses, trying to spot any sign of watchers. The buildings looked abandoned. A few windows were boarded up. Trash littered the gutters. Yet in the lingering daylight, the old car stood out like a malignant presence. Sam swallowed hard. "What do we do?" he whispered. Andy exhaled. "We need to confirm that Diaz is linked to it," he said. "But if this is the car, we should call the police. They can match it to the paint scrapings from your dad's car." He dug into his pocket for his phone, prepared to dial. But then he paused, uncertain. After all, in their interactions with the local station, they had encountered roadblocks. And if the police came roaring in without solid evidence of who owned the vehicle, the criminals might slip away again. Sam looked at Andy with determination. "Let's get a closer look," he whispered. His voice trembled, but his eyes were fierce. "We'll take pictures, see if we can find something connecting it to Diaz. Then we can show the police." Andy hesitated, nerves flickering across his face. But Sam was already unbuckling his seatbelt. They both knew how dangerous this could be. Yet the weight of Mark and Alice's comas pressed down on them, fueling their desperation. If they walked away, if they hesitated too long, they might lose their one chance at justice. They stepped out of the car, carefully shutting the doors as quietly as possible. The street was eerily silent. A stray cat slunk across the sidewalk, disappearing behind a fence. The wind carried the faint stench of rotting garbage. Sam's heart hammered so loudly, he was sure anyone nearby could hear it. As they approached the vehicle, they saw the paint was even more corroded up close. It was indeed the same make and model Mark drove whenever he investigated certain high-risk suspects. Sam ran his palm over the dented side panel, his stomach clenching at the memory of how it had slammed into his parents' car. He took pictures with his phone, focusing on the lack of a license plate, the identifying rust patterns. His eyes flicked over the interior, noticing trash strewn on the passenger seat. Most ominously, he saw faint red streaks on the back seat's worn upholstery. His heart lurched. Was that blood? It looked dried and old, but it made him feel sick. Andy crouched near the rear of the vehicle, checking the bumper. His brow furrowed. "Sam," he whispered, beckoning him over. Sam joined him, and Andy pointed to a patch of scraped paint. "Look at that. It's a mismatch, as if this piece had contact with something. Possibly your family's car." He took a close-up photo. "Your dad's colleagues could match this paint sample, confirm it was the same vehicle involved in the crash?" Before they could investigate further, a door slammed somewhere behind them. A harsh voice shouted, "Hey! What do you think you're doing?" Sam and Andy spun around. A tall, lean man with short-cropped black hair strode towards them from behind a fence. He was clutching a baseball bat. His face twisted into anger as he recognized that Sam and Andy were snooping around the old car. Sam's breath caught in his throat. He guessed this must be Rafael Diaz. If not Diaz, then at least one of his close associates. The man's features contorted with fury, the muscles of his forearm flexing as he gripped the bat. "Get away from there," he snarled, picking up his pace. "You think you can spy on me?" Andy's eyes widened, and he grabbed Sam's arm. "Run," he urged, voice trembling. They sprinted back towards Andy's car. The man with the bat, Rafael or whoever he was, began to sprint as well, shouting. A pair of other men emerged from the alley, alerted by the commotion. They, too, started running at full speed. Sam's chest constricted with fear. They were outnumbered, and their pursuers were bigger, faster. The length of the block seemed to stretch endlessly before them. Somehow, they managed to fling themselves into Andy's car, hands shaking so hard that Andy fumbled the keys. He started the engine, the men behind them now just yards away. One of them shouted, "Don't let them leave!" Another brandished a length of pipe. Sam clenched his eyes shut, adrenaline roaring in his veins. The engine roared to life. Andy slammed the accelerator, the tires squealing. The car lurched forward, narrowly missing one of the men who swung the bat at the back window. They peeled away, hearts pounding. Sam turned around to look and saw the men sprinting back to the rusted old car, presumably to follow them. "They're coming!" Sam gasped. Andy's hands tightened on the wheel. "We'll lose them," he promised, though fear trembled beneath his words. They sped through the labyrinth of side streets, ignoring traffic signals in their desperation. Soon enough, Sam spotted the dreaded rust bucket of a car in the rearview mirror, weaving wildly across lanes. Another car joined it, a battered sedan that must have belonged to one of the accomplices. Now there were two vehicles chasing them. Sam's stomach twisted. During the frantic chase, Sam managed to call the police. His voice quavered as he said, "They're chasing us. They're armed. We're near Riverton and Elm." The operator tried to get more details, but Sam's attention was split between the phone and the screaming chaos around them. Andy took a sharp turn, nearly careening into a row of trash cans. The two cars behind them closed in. Sam glanced at the fuel gauge. His heart sank. The needle was dangerously close to empty. "We're running out of gas," he croaked, voice barely audible. Andy's jaw clenched. "We'll do what we can," he said. "Just stay down. The police will find us." But a creeping dread told them both that they might not evade their pursuers in time. The wail of sirens was still distant, if present at all. They careened onto a deserted commercial street with shuttered shops on either side. The engine coughed, starved for fuel. Andy guided the car around a corner, hoping to gain enough distance to hide. The vehicle sputtered. Then the engine died completely. Their momentum carried them a little farther, and then they came to a stop. Andy's breath came in gasps. "We have to run," he said, but even as he reached for the door handle, they heard the screech of tires behind them. The old, rusted car and its companion pulled up, blocking the street. Men poured out, shouting curses. Sam peered through the window, heart pounding so violently he thought it might burst. They had baseball bats, pipes, one had a length of chain. The leader, presumably Raphael, glared at them, eyes wild. "Get out of the car!" he roared, bat lifted. Andy and Sam sat frozen, adrenaline coursing through their veins. Andy's voice shook as he muttered, "We can't let them drag us out. Stay calm." But the men advanced, crowding around the sedan. One of them pounded on the window with a pipe, cracks spiderwebbing the glass. Sam's mind raced. The phone call to the police. Would they really arrive in time? He could see in the rearview that more men were emerging from the second car, at least 4 or 5 in total. A wave of hopelessness crashed over him. Then he thought of his parents, lying in the hospital. He couldn't let these men get away, not after all they had done. And, crucially, he could not let them hurt Andy. The men were now screaming at them. "Open the door! Now!" Their voices echoed, furious and triumphant, as though certain they had cornered their prey. One man reached for the driver's side handle, yanking it fiercely. Suddenly, a chorus of sirens filled the air. Police vehicles, at least 2 or 3 by the sound of it, sped onto the scene, lights flashing across the dim street. Sam felt an overwhelming rush of relief. The criminals, however, did not scatter as he had expected. Instead, one of them grabbed a police officer who stumbled in his approach, trapping him in a chokehold. "Back off!" the criminal shouted, pressing a piece of metal to the officer's side. "Or he's done for!" Chaos erupted. Police were yelling, forming a perimeter. They shouted orders at the gang. The men brandished their makeshift weapons. A standoff loomed, tension crackling in the air like static electricity. Sam's breath quickened. He watched as the officer squirmed in the criminal's grasp, terror in his eyes. Andy gripped Sam's shoulder. "Stay here," he hissed. "Don't move." But Sam's gaze locked on the captive officer. He saw the panic in the officer's face, saw how the gang members were using him as a shield, threatening the entire negotiation. Sam recalled how the criminals in the warehouse had threatened them, how they had left his parents in that crashed car. A storm of fear and anger welled up inside him. He pictured the possibility that these criminals might escape again, might continue their vile operation. Suddenly, in the confusion, Sam saw an opening. One of the criminals had moved just slightly away from the back seat of Andy's car. Sam realized that if he opened his door swiftly and forcefully, he might catch someone off guard, disrupt the standoff. It was reckless. It was dangerous. But it might create an opening for the police to subdue them. Without thinking too long, because he knew if he did, he might lose his nerve, Sam flung the car door open with all his strength. The heavy metal caught one of the gang members in the side, knocking him off balance. He stumbled backward, crashing into another. The man holding the officer jerked in surprise, releasing his grip just enough. The officer elbowed him in the gut and scrambled away, coughing for air. A split second of chaos followed. Police officers seized the opportunity, rushing forward with shouts of, "Down on the ground!" The criminals attempted to fight back, brandishing their bats and pipes, but they were quickly overwhelmed by the flurry of uniforms. Sam could hardly see through the crush of bodies, but he heard the clatter of metal objects hitting the concrete, heard men cursing in frustration as officers pinned them. Another officer grabbed the one Sam had knocked down with the door, twisting his arms behind his back. The old, rusted car sat nearby, a silent witness to the gang's defeat. When the dust settled, Sam realized he was trembling from head to toe. Police officers were everywhere, some panting from exertion, others barking orders for the criminals to remain still as they secured them with restraints. Andy turned to Sam, relief and shock mingling on his face. "You could have been hurt," he whispered, voice wavering. But he also looked at Sam with something like pride in his eyes. One of the officers approached, a middle-aged woman with a badge glinting under the streetlights. "You all right, kid?" she asked, scanning Sam for injuries. Sam nodded, adrenaline still surging. I'm okay," he managed to say, though he felt like he might collapse at any moment. The officer nodded in acknowledgement, grateful that he was unharmed. The police swiftly searched the gang's cars, confiscating weapons and radioing for backup to impound the vehicles. Sam's heart thudded as he saw an officer examine the battered old car. The policeman gestured to a partner, pointing out the missing plates and the extensive rust. "We'll have this towed," the officer declared. "We'll test it against the paint samples from the accident Mark Greenfield was in." Sam stepped forward, still unsteady. "That car, it's the one," he said, fighting the urge to break down. The policeman gave him a sympathetic glance, then gently guided Sam back to Andy. Before long, a different police officer approached them, someone Sam recognized from previous visits to the station with his father. The officer patted Sam on the shoulder. "You were very brave," he said. "Reckless, but brave. Don't ever do anything like that again, all right?" He managed a tight smile. Sam nodded, a wave of emotion crashing over him. It was all so overwhelming, the fear, the relief, the anger, the sorrow. The chase was over, but Sam's heart remained clenched with worry. His parents were still in the hospital, still comatose. The criminals might have been arrested, but there would be legal procedures, trials. Who knew how extensive the ring was or if they had other members still roaming free? Sam could not rest easy until he saw his parents awake, until he felt certain they were safe. Andy wrapped an arm around Sam. "Let's get you out of here," he murmured, guiding Sam away from the chaos. A few bystanders had emerged on the street, whispering about the sirens, the arrests. Sam felt numb, as if the entire confrontation had been some fevered dream. They caught a ride in a police car back to the station, where statements were taken. Sam recounted everything in detail: the chase, the assault, how they recognized the old car. He deliberately left out the part about how they had been tracking these suspects for weeks, though it might come up in Mark's notes anyway. Andy corroborated Sam's story, explaining how the criminals had threatened them. The police were impressed that Sam had managed to create a diversion at a critical moment, though they scolded him for risking his own safety. Papers were filed. There was talk of formal charges. Sam and Andy gave the name Mark Greenfield, explaining that Sam was Mark's son and had recognized the car from the crash. The officers nodded, solemn and supportive. It was late into the night when they finally left the station, drained beyond words. Andy's car, out of fuel, had to be towed, so they caught a ride from a friend of the family who had come to pick them up. As they rode in the back seat of the friend's car, Sam stared out the window, mind swirling with fatigue and numbness. The city lights blurred, reflecting his muddled thoughts. Relief waged war with lingering terror. They had done it, to a degree. They had found the car, faced the criminals, and with police help, apprehended them. But the question that gnawed at Sam's heart was, what now? Would his parents ever know what had happened? Would they be able to wake up and see justice done? The moment they arrived at the hospital, Sam was exhausted, but he refused to wait until the next day to see his parents. He needed to check on them, to share the news and whatever faint hope that they might hear him. Andy walked beside him, breathing unsteadily from the night's ordeal. They ascended the hospital elevator in tense silence. Each ding of the passing floors sounded like a drumbeat in Sam's ears. When they reached the ward, Sam rushed to the room where his parents were placed. The door was open, and inside, he saw a sight that shattered the weariness from his eyes. Both Mark and Alice were awake, propped slightly upright, engaged in quiet conversation with a police officer. Sam's first thought was that he was hallucinating from stress. But as he took a few steps closer, he saw his father's eyes flick towards him. He heard Alice softly say his name. And then everything inside him burst. "They're awake," Andy whispered, voice quavering with joy. Sam felt tears well up, unstoppable and fierce. He staggered forward, every last bit of resolve he had used to stay strong now crumbling in a wave of overwhelming relief. Mark's voice was faint, but it held a warmth Sam recognized. "Sam," he said. "Come here." He extended a weak hand, beckoning Sam. Alice, too, seemed dazed and frail, but there was life in her eyes that had been missing for so long. Sam practically fell onto the bed, burying his face in his father's hospital blankets, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Dad, Mom," he choked. "I was so scared." Mark managed a gentle smile, though lines of pain creased his brow. "It's all right," he whispered. "We're here. And we heard about—" He coughed softly, his throat still dry from weeks of disuse. "We heard about what you did tonight. You helped catch them." Alice's hand found Sam's shoulder, giving it a faint squeeze. "We love you so much," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. Sam could no longer contain the torrent of feelings within him. He sobbed, relief and heartbreak mingling in each tear. He was barely aware of the police officer in the room, the doctors who had come to check on his parents' sudden awakening, the bustle of activity. All that mattered was that his mother and father were awake at last. The nurse eventually guided Sam gently aside, so the doctors could inspect Mark and Alice's vitals. Andy stood in the doorway, tears in his own eyes. He caught Sam's gaze and gave him a nod, as if to say, "We made it." Hours blurred as medical staff confirmed that Mark and Alice's comas had broken, though they remained in fragile states. Each had a long road of recovery ahead. The policeman who had been in the room explained that the department had come to inform them of the arrests, and to gauge Mark's condition, since he was the lead detective on the case. Sam sat on the edge of a chair, hands trembling in his lap, listening to the officer confirm that the criminals apprehended that night were believed to be key figures in the local ring Mark had been investigating. "Your boy was critical in helping us catch them," the officer said, addressing Mark. "He's quite the brave young man you have." Mark's eyes glistened, and he turned to Sam, beckoning him closer. "We're proud of you, Sam," Mark said, wincing a bit as he tried to shift himself upright. "Proud of you for being strong when we couldn't be there." Alice nodded, tearful. "I'm so sorry we weren't there for you, sweetheart. But you—" She paused, voice trembling. "You've grown up so quickly." Sam could only manage a nod, biting his lower lip to keep from crying again. Words failed him. He felt relief, sadness, joy, and exhaustion all rolled into one tight knot in his chest. Gradually, the story tumbled out of Sam and Andy, how they had searched Mark's office, found the files, meticulously tracked every name, and eventually stumbled upon the car that ran the family off the road. Mark listened with astonishment. He was too weak to speak at length, but he asked questions in brief spurts, clearly eager for updates on the ring. He expressed gratitude towards Andy for caring for Sam, for ensuring that Mark's work did not go unfinished. The policemen in the room seemed both impressed and concerned. "It was a dangerous path," he told them. "But it looks like we've uncovered enough to make a solid case. We'll be working closely with Mark once he's stable enough." At some point in the early hours of morning, Sam slipped away to the hallway, sinking onto a bench. The reality of the night's events washed over him, leaving him tired to the bone. He could still smell the faint whiff of burning rubber, see the grim expressions of the criminals as the police surrounded them. Uncle Andy found him there, gently draped a jacket over Sam's shoulders, and sat down beside him. "Kiddo," Andy said softly, "they're awake. Everything's going to be all right now." Sam blinked, tears stinging his eyes again. "I know," he whispered. "I'm just—" He couldn't quite articulate how relieved and scared he still was. He thought of the pictures of trafficked children, the faces Mark had been trying to save, and realized this was bigger than him, bigger than his family. Lives had been at stake. And they still were. Andy seemed to read his thoughts. "Your dad's going to push the case forward," Andy said. "That's who he is. With him back, the rest of the ring won't stand a chance." Sam nodded. He wanted to believe that. He wanted to believe the threat was now contained and that his parents would recover fully, that the city would be rid of the child trafficking operation. The burden of uncertainty remained, but in that moment, Sam allowed himself a moment of hope. He felt Andy's reassuring presence. He thought of his parents just a few rooms away, and for the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe without the weight of 1,000 worries crushing him. Still, it was not as simple as stepping away from the darkness once dawn broke. Mark and Alice stayed in the hospital for a long time, each day a small victory as they regained strength in their limbs, as they began physical therapy sessions to recover from the muscle atrophy. Mark's head injury left him with migraines and memory lapses at first, But as he improved, he became more like himself, sharp-eyed, quietly determined. Alice had a gentler recovery, though she was weak and needed assistance to walk for a while. Through it all, Sam and Andy remained close, sometimes sleeping in the waiting room or bringing homemade food to the hospital. The investigation into the child trafficking ring, now supplemented by Mark's extensive records and by the criminals the police had captured, moved forward. More arrests were made as the criminals divulged the locations of safe houses and accomplices in exchange for plea bargains. With Mark recovering, he was able to confirm details in his own notes, guiding the police to additional evidence and ensuring the ring's structure was exposed from top to bottom. Bit by bit, the vile operation unraveled. At first, Sam feared the criminals might come after them again, try another attempt to silence Mark or Sam. But the ring had sustained a major blow. Its leadership was behind bars or on the run. Moreover, the police were vigilant, especially given that Mark Greenfield was one of their own. Sam found solace in that knowledge, though he still slept with a nightlight, haunted by the memory of squealing tires and shattered glass. Months passed, each day a step away from the horrifying start of it all. Sam sometimes felt as if that day on the freeway had happened to someone else. He had changed. He was still quiet and studious, but there was a certain resolve in his eyes that had not been there before. He knew the taste of fear, and he had discovered a well of courage inside himself he never knew existed. When Mark was finally released from the hospital, still walking with a cane to steady his weakened leg, he insisted on returning to police work, albeit on a reduced schedule. "There are children out there who still need us," he said firmly. Sam overheard him speaking to Alice about it. She was apprehensive, but she understood. After all, it was Mark's nature to protect others. And, in truth, his expertise was invaluable in dismantling the last remnants of the ring. Sam admired him for that, but he also worried for his father's well-being, wanting him to rest and fully recover. Alice, too, came home eventually, though the doctors insisted on frequent checkups. She still tired easily, and Mark would help her as they slowly walked around the block, accompanied by Sam. Those walks became a time for the family to reconnect, to talk about everything that had happened. Sam would hold his mother's arm to steady her, listening to her soft voice. She often thanked him for being brave, for never giving up when she and Mark could not speak for themselves. One evening, a few months after the fateful night of the chase, Sam found himself sitting in the living room with Andy, Mark, and Alice. The hospital bills had put a strain on their finances, but the community pitched in some support, and Mark's insurance covered a portion. Their home was still warm and cozy, though Sam now noticed the small signs of wear, the scuff marks on the floor, the chipped paint near the baseboards. Home was home, though, and with the family back together, it felt like a fortress compared to the lonely nights Sam spent without them. Mark had the files spread out on the coffee table, reviewing them for what seemed like the 100th time. Alice sat beside him, occasionally offering him a cup of tea. Andy rested on the sofa, rubbing the tension from his own neck. Sam perched on an armchair, hugging a pillow to his chest. Over the course of the conversation, Mark explained that the ring's leaders were scheduled for a major court hearing in a couple of weeks, with multiple charges that could put them behind bars for decades. Looking at Sam, Mark said, "Thank you for believing there was more to the crash than an accident. If you hadn't, who knows if we would have uncovered the full extent of what they were doing." Sam flushed with pride, fiddling with the pillow's corner. I knew something was wrong," he said. "It didn't make sense how the car swerved at us." Alice reached out and squeezed Sam's hand. "Your father and I owe our lives to you and Andy," she said softly. "That was incredibly risky, investigating those criminals. Please don't ever do something like that again if you can help it." Andy chuckled faintly. "We did what we had to," he said. "But I'd also be happy not to tangle with any more baseball bat-wielding goons." Sam let out a shaky laugh, remembering the terror of that chase, the adrenaline surge that nearly paralyzed him. "No arguments from me," he murmured. He thought of the police officer they had saved, the chaos on that street. He still had nightmares sometimes, replaying the events like a film in his mind. The night stretched on as they discussed the upcoming trial. Mark was expected to testify, and there was a possibility Sam would be called as a witness, given that he was the sole surviving immediate witness of the crash. The thought made Sam's stomach churn. He wanted to bring the criminals to justice, yes, but the idea of standing in a courtroom, reliving the moment the car slammed into them, terrified him. Mark noticed Sam's anxious expression and said, "We'll figure it out together. The prosecutors will make sure you're prepared." Alice said, "You're not alone, sweetheart. We'll be right there." The warmth in her voice settled Sam's nerves. The weeks ahead passed in a blur of physical therapy sessions and meetings with lawyers. Sam tried to keep up with school, but his focus drifted to the looming day in court. When that day arrived, he wore his best shirt and a pair of neatly pressed pants, feeling too warm under the collar. Mark, still using a cane, accompanied him, along with Alice. Andy was there for moral support. The courthouse smelled of old books and disinfectant. Echoing footsteps rang off the polished floors. They were led into a large, formal courtroom. It seemed intimidating. A high ceiling, rows of benches, the judge's bench elevated at the front. Sam's heart pounded. On the defendant's side, he recognized some of the criminals from the night of the chase. The same hardened faces, glaring with hostility. One of them was indeed Rafael Diaz, who had an expression of cold anger that made Sam's skin crawl. Sam spotted the battered old car driver among them, the one who had brandished the baseball bat. Or was it the same man who had threatened the police officer? Sam's memory blurred, but it hardly mattered. They were a group, all connected to the ring. When Sam was called to the stand, he felt a jolt of panic. Mark rested a reassuring hand on his shoulder as Sam rose. Each step felt heavier than the last. Sam took an oath to tell the truth, then sat. The prosecutor, a stern-faced woman in a neat suit, asked him gentle yet probing questions about the accident. Sam recounted in detail how the old car swerved intentionally, how he watched it drive away after their vehicle flipped. He explained how he recognized the car when he and Andy found it parked in that dingy street, how he had confirmed it was the same one from the crash. The defense attorney tried to cast doubt, but Sam's recollection was steady, strengthened by the trauma etched in his mind. Evidence in the form of paint scrapings and forensic analysis corroborated his memory. Sam could not bring himself to look at the defendants for long, but he heard one of them mutter under his breath. When Sam stepped down from the witness stand, his legs felt weak. Alice was waiting for him, guiding him to a seat. Mark squeezed his hand, gratitude shining in his eyes. After that, Mark took the stand, explaining his role as a detective investigating child trafficking. He detailed how he had gathered evidence, the threats he had received, how he suspected certain criminal elements wanted to silence him. The entire room listened intently. The leadership of the ring, once so secretive, now found their crimes laid bare for the court to see. It took days for the trial to conclude. Sam did not attend every session, he had school, and the emotional toll was too much. But Mark and the prosecutor kept him informed. Ultimately, the jury found the key defendants guilty on multiple counts: attempted homicide, kidnapping, conspiracy, and a host of other charges. Some of the lesser members of the ring pled out to reduce sentences, providing evidence against the ringleaders. The judge passed lengthy sentences, ensuring that most of the perpetrators would not see freedom for decades. The tension that had lingered in Sam's chest for so long slowly lifted. Justice was not always swift, but it came, and it came in force. In the aftermath, Sam and Andy were hailed as heroes by many in the department. Mark praised his son's bravery, though he gently reminded Sam not to take such reckless risks in the future. The police officer whose life Sam saved with that car door spoke to local media, crediting Sam's quick thinking. It was surreal for Sam to see glimpses of himself on the local news, described as the heroic boy who helped crack the case. His classmates at school stared at him with awe, but all Sam truly cared about was the fact that his parents were healing, that the criminals who nearly cost them their lives were behind bars, and that the vulnerable children caught in the ring were finally receiving help. At home, as the days rolled by and the trial became an event of the past, Life gradually assumed a semblance of normalcy, though Sam would argue it was a new normal, irreversibly shaped by the events they had endured. Alice's strength returned bit by bit, and she busied herself with organizing charitable drives, determined to help rehabilitate rescued children. Mark continued working closely with Child Protection Services and the department, albeit with a scaled-back schedule. Uncle Andy came over frequently for dinners, no longer just a caretaker but a cherished part of the family's everyday life. The house itself, once silent and sorrowful, was alive again with conversation, music, and laughter, though the fear and sorrow of the past lingered in the corners of each room, a reminder of how fragile life could be. Sam sometimes caught Mark looking at him with a mix of pride and concern. Mark sat with Sam one afternoon, just the two of them, after one of Mark's physical therapy sessions. They shared cups of tea in the kitchen while Alice rested upstairs. The golden light of sunset streamed in through the window, bathing the kitchen in warmth. Mark tapped his cane on the floor thoughtfully. "I owe you an apology," Mark said quietly, gazing at Sam. "And a thank you? I'm sorry you had to go through so much because of my work. If I had handled things differently, maybe the crash wouldn't have happened." Sam shook his head fiercely. "No, Dad. It's not your fault. Those people made the choice to target you. You were trying to help children. That's never wrong." Mark's eyes grew misty. "You're a good kid," he murmured. "And you're right. But I still wish I could have spared you the danger." Sam glanced down, remembering all the terrifying moments, the nightmares, the chase. Then he lifted his gaze, letting out a slow breath. "We're okay," he said, voice trembling slightly. "We made it through. And because of you, a lot of children aren't in danger anymore." Mark reached over and placed a hand on Sam's. "We'll keep moving forward," he said. "Together." Those words stuck with Sam. In the months that followed, he watched as his parents regained much of their old vitality. Alice gradually returned to her volunteer work. Mark took up a teaching role at the police academy, mentoring younger detectives in the intricacies of tackling organized crime. Sam thrived in school, though he occasionally consulted with a counselor to process the trauma. Uncle Andy found a new sense of purpose as well, dabbling in community outreach for at-risk youth, perhaps inspired by the darkest corners of the ring they had helped expose. And so life continued, not entirely unscarred, but enriched by the knowledge that they had persevered through darkness and emerged into light. The echoes of the conspiracy lingered. Sam would never forget the cruelty and desperation he saw in the criminals' eyes, nor would he forget the grateful smiles of children rescued from nightmarish circumstances. The city, too, was not magically cured of all its ills, but one significant threat had been uprooted. Many months later, there came a day that felt both ordinary and precious, Sam's 13th birthday. He woke to the smell of fresh pancakes drifting up from the kitchen. His heart fluttered with a sense of excitement, a reminder that he was still just a kid at heart, despite having faced terrible trials. When he came downstairs, he saw his mother flipping pancakes at the stove, a bright pink apron around her waist. His father sat at the table, cane propped beside him, reading the morning paper and sipping coffee, looking stronger than he had in ages. "Morning, champ," Mark said, setting aside the paper. "Happy birthday." Alice turned around, beaming, and greeted him. "Happy birthday, sweetie. Have a seat. We made chocolate chip pancakes." Sam slid into a chair, feeling a surge of gratitude so intense it nearly brought tears to his eyes. He still remembered the sterile hospital ward, the hush of machines breathing for his parents. Now here they were, bustling about the kitchen, smiling and alive. Uncle Andy burst in through the back door moments later, singing an off-key birthday tune and carrying a small wrapped present. It was silly, mundane, and absolutely perfect. They ate breakfast together, joking and reminiscing about Sam's previous birthdays. Mark teased Sam about his early morning hair. Alice recounted a story of how Sam once used to hide behind the couch to avoid surprise parties. Andy insisted on retelling the comedic version of the fiasco with the criminals, though the memory still carried a darker undertone. Sam laughed, genuinely laughed, and felt the last vestiges of that sickening fear melt away. Later that day, Sam found himself sitting outside on the porch, gazing up at the sky. The air was mild, the chirping of birds a soothing melody. In the quiet, he reflected on the year that had passed. It had begun with unimaginable terror, a car spinning out of control, the horrifying uncertainty of whether his parents would live or die. Then came the heartbreak of seeing them lying comatose, the nightmare of uncovering a child trafficking ring, the late-night stakeouts, the violent confrontation that nearly claimed their lives. Yet here he was, older, wiser, and with his parents safe beside him. He felt the cool breeze brush against his cheeks, carrying away the weight of the past. Somewhere inside the house, his parents and uncle were preparing for a small gathering of close friends, just a few well-wishers from the neighborhood, some of Sam's classmates, and a couple of officers who had become family friends. Sam felt a stirring in his chest, a mixture of contentment and humility. Life was fragile, yes, but it was also resilient. People could come together to right wrongs and protect one another, even in the face of sinister forces. He closed his eyes, remembering the vow he had made by his parents' hospital beds, to do everything in his power to see justice done. Though Sam was no vigilante, and though he was still a kid, that sense of responsibility had taken root in his heart. Someday, he thought, he might follow in his father's footsteps, become someone who sought out truth and protected those who could not protect themselves. For now, he was just Sam, a 13-year-old about to cut his birthday cake and blow out the candles in front of family and friends. He opened his eyes and gazed at the horizon, the sun shining bright. "Mom, Dad," he whispered softly to himself, "we're going to be all right." And in that moment, he believed it with all his heart. He stood, tucking hands into his pockets, and wandered back into the house, where laughter and the sweet smell of frosting beckoned him forward into the future. Indeed, while scars remained, both physical and emotional, the Greenfield family endured. Their resilience had been tested, and they had prevailed. The city, no stranger to hardship, now had one less web of evil lurking in its shadows. And for Sam, quiet, academically gifted Sam, life had forever changed. He had stared down danger, comforted his comatose parents through lonely nights, and played a pivotal role in bringing justice to those who preyed on the innocent. Though the path had been fraught with terror, it also led him toward a deeper understanding of courage and hope. In time, Mark fully recovered his stride, that slight limp barely noticeable. Alice returned to her many volunteer efforts, forging partnerships with shelters and youth programs that helped rehabilitate the rescued children. Andy, who had shared in the family's pain and triumph, remained an unwavering presence. And Sam continued to thrive, tutoring classmates, winning science fairs, and occasionally stopping by the police academy with Mark to see the next generation of officers. Whenever he caught a glimpse of an old, rusted car on the road, he felt a pang of memory, but it no longer paralyzed him with fear. It was a memory of what had nearly destroyed him, and of what, in the end, had strengthened him beyond measure. He never forgot the darkest hours, the tears and nightmares, or how close he came to losing everything. But he also never forgot the lessons learned, that sometimes, you have to fight for what is right, even when the odds are against you. That the truth, once uncovered, has a power all its own. And that love for family, love for justice, is the fuel that can carry you through the unthinkable. Indeed, Sam Greenfield's life had been flipped upside down by a horrific car crash. But in that upheaval, he discovered within himself a courage that would guide him the rest of his days. And so, as the Greenfield family continued on their journey, they did so with unwavering determination. The conspirators responsible for that fateful crash were behind bars, paying for their crimes. Mark, Alice, and Sam had come back from the brink of tragedy, forging a stronger bond than ever before. Quiet nights at home felt like a gift, a reminder of how life can twist in an instant. When they sat around the dinner table, laughter echoing off the walls, the darkness of that old conspiracy seemed distant, never fully gone, but subdued by the warmth of this family's unity. For Sam, the future stretched out wide and bright. Yes, nightmares still lurked on the edge of sleep. Yes, he still felt a thrill of panic whenever a car swerved too quickly in the next lane. healing took time. Yet each day he rose, went to school, solved puzzles in math class, hung out with friends, and returned home to parents who were, in many ways, his heroes. They had risked everything in their fight for justice, and now, it was Sam who had carried that mantle, if only briefly. Perhaps someday he, too, would protect others from the shadows that tried to swallow the innocent. Until then, he embraced the quiet joys, Sunday outings with Andy, listening to Beatles records with Mark, the same songs that had played on that fateful day, except now they no longer filled him with dread, and sharing late-night talks with Alice about life, love, and the lingering questions of what if. No one ever promised life would be easy. But as Sam looked around at his family, safe and whole, he understood that sometimes, in the wake of great darkness, you could find a deeper light. And that light, fueled by love and justice, could guide you through any storm. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already and subscribe for more.